So the Illuvium team has talked about having rails set for the price of fuel and not allowing it to go above 25% or below 25% of, I'm guessing, whatever baseline that they choose to start with. But are these rails really necessary? The more you dive deeper into it, it's really the difference between a centralized economy and a decentralized economy. Recently, I posted another video that had talked about the price of fuel and the model that Illuvium was using versus a model that I came up with. So if you want some context for this video, you might want to check that out. I'll leave a card up here or a link in the description. But that video really started a discussion, and that's what I was hoping to do. I was a little surprised with some of the responses, and I really think it comes down to more of confusion in how I explained it in that first video. So in this video, I want to go through the questions that were brought up from that video and really the differences between Illuvium's model and a free market model. So let's just start with some of the questions that have been brought up here. The biggest thing that kept coming up from this conversation was that if you let fuel be priced by the free market, then the overworld players will get priced out, and that would slow down adoption and not allow the game to be expanded to more and more players. I did explain this in the other video, but maybe I didn't explain it enough. But you can have fuel be priced by the free market and have it not affect the overworld players at all by simply pricing the in-game transaction pegged to a US dollar versus pegged to an amount of units of fuel. And so how that works, if you look down here, scenario A is basically Illuvium's model with the rails. We're going to use 375 units of crypton just for an example here. We don't know that that's what they're going to choose. Whether the demand is at the baseline or if it's down 25%, or if it's up 25%, the overworld players are always going to pay 375 units for that tier 1 travel, for example. The difference is that for the overworld players, it's not pegged to a US dollar price, but the rails prevent it from going up or down 25%. So again, at the lower end, the overworld players might be paying 75 cents for that travel, and at the upper end, they might be paying $1.25 for that travel. The way it works in my model is that the travel cost, say for this tier 1 or stage 1 travel, is always going to be pegged to $1. So at the baseline of 1, it would cost that same 375 crypton and $1. But what happens is if the demand drops, let's say to that 25% down, then the travel cost remains at $1. But now that means the overworld players need to buy 500 units of crypton. But keep in mind, in this model, 500 units of crypton is still only going to equal $1. And if you go the other way, 25% up, again, overworld players are only paying $1. Again, overworld players are paying $1 for that travel, but with that dollar, they're buying 300 units of crypton in order to travel. And the great thing about this model is that it can scale in a more decentralized way. So again, it could go much lower, let's say 70% down, and it might cost 1,250 crypton. But again, overworld players are only going to pay that $1 for it. Now, if it goes the other way, where you're up, like, say, 200%, then that $1 is going to get an overworld player 125 units of crypton, which will get them that tier 1 travel. And another thing to keep in mind here is that if you peg this travel to a US dollar, then it's going to be more consistent revenue for Illuvium and for the ILV stakers. Because no matter what the market does, these players are always going to pay that same amount in US dollars for that in-game transaction. But okay, let's go back to some more of the questions here. So one of the biggest problems that has been coming up, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it has been put, is that the lore wouldn't make sense. In that, in my model, as the fuel goes up in price or down in price, it would mean that the same travel one day might cost more units of crypton than the day before. And while I somewhat understand where that's coming from a lore standpoint, but it still requires lore to satisfy Illuvium's model as well. Illuvium had said if they need to increase production of the fuel, then what they could do is they could bring in like a hypothetical storm of hyperion, and your converters are able to extract more hyperion from the atmosphere. But there are ways in a free market model for the lore to fit in as well. This was actually an idea that came up from the last video from someone in the comments. You can make it as the price of fuel goes up, that it increases the purity of the fuel so it costs less units for that travel or for whatever in-game purchase that is. And this brings us into the third question here. Can't Illuvium just adjust the production of the fuel to meet the demand? And yes, they can, and that's what they've talked about. And then you end up with a more stable price, but a more volatile supply. And then this also comes down to the trust and the centralization of the fuel's value. Now think about the reason why a lot of us got into crypto and especially something like Bitcoin. It's because our fiat or US dollars in my case are manipulated by the government to meet the demand. So when we had a pandemic, the government gave us all stimulus checks to increase the supply. And now that inflation is going crazy, the Fed is increasing interest rates to bring the demand down. Now, if we rely on the centralization of Illuvium, then they're going to be dictating whether the supply goes up or the supply goes down. Like I said, it works the same way as our fiat money that most of us agree is not a great model. If you've been saving up a lot of your fuel for a later date hoping you can sell it, and then you see that the demand went up, so changes were made that you can now produce a lot more fuel, then that really hurts the savers, and you're really losing value on what you've saved. In a free market model with at least a more stable supply, then if you choose to save your fuel and the demand goes up, then the value is also going to go up much higher, instead of all of a sudden everyone is producing more fuel. Another thing is someone brought up this model and said, wouldn't it make the price of fuel pointless? And the answer is yes and no. For the overworld players, it sort of would make the price useless, because if they're going to pay $1 to travel to a stage 1 region, then they're always going to pay that $1 to travel to a stage 1 region. Whether a unit of crypton is worth 0.0001 cent or whether a crypton is worth 10 cents. But it's not pointless at all for the landowners and the Illuvium Zero players, because then there's more strategy that comes into place. Do they want to hold it and hope the value goes up, or do they want to sell it as it comes in, thinking that the value might go down? And that dynamic of thinking doesn't really come into play if you're setting the rails up or down 25%, because once you go up to that 25%, there's no reason to hold any longer. It would almost force everyone to sell. Another question that was brought up was, will a free market allow for whale manipulation? And while I can see where they're coming from, because we hear that all the time, whales are manipulating, Bitcoin or stocks, you also have to think that the landowners and the fuel producers are really only seeing 5% of what the Illuvium DAO is getting from purchases made in the overworld. So essentially every unit of fuel that an overworld player sells to the balancer pool, Illuvium's DAO mints 19 and also sells it to that balancer. So if you have some whales, let's say they're controlling 10% of the fuel, which is a high number already. But 10% of the fuel can't manipulate the price that much, because that 10% is actually 10% of the 5% that the fuel producers actually control. So you're really looking at, so is that 0.05% of the fuel? So it's really not going to allow that much manipulation to occur in the first place. And then when we go to what I think is the most important question to really be had here, and really why I'm making this video, is what happens if the demand falls below that 25% rail? What's going to hold up that rail? We can see how the upper rail happens, because if we go beyond that 25% demand, then the DAO just chips in and sells more fuel to the overworld players. So then the DAO is getting that money. And I know there's other ways for the DAO to redistribute that additional revenue to the landowners, but again, that's just a step that I don't think is necessary. But when the demand drops below 25%, what does everyone expect is going to happen? Do we think that the DAO is going to give up their 95% and go down to 92, 90% so that the fuel of the landowners can be held up to that lower rail? I don't think anyone believes that's going to happen. Even if that's the plan from the beginning, we've seen things like how the first sale of Illuvatars might go to the DAO and not be given out as Rev Dis, because the DAO needs the extra liquidity for runway and so that the DAO doesn't fall apart. So if we go into another bear market in the future and that demand drops down, the DAO isn't going to give up their money. What they're more likely to do is set out an IIP that says, hey, in order for the DAO to sustain through this bear market, we need to eliminate that lower rail. And we know an IIP like that will get passed because the council's responsibility is to protect the DAO. So if we know that that lower rail can't be held up, then why should we be held to that higher rail? I'd rather see it so that there are no rails. And if demand goes down a ton, then oh well, our fuel is down a lot. The landowners can choose to save until it increases in value. But I don't think as landowners we should be penalized with an upper rail if we know that that lower rail can't be held up. So again, let me just show you what's going on here. In that top scenario with the rails, we go up to 25%. And that means in this case where we're using 375 units of fuel, your fuel units are only going to max out at $0.0033 per unit. And then beyond that, Illuvium would be looking to either increase the fuel supply on your land, causing inflation, or they can find a way to redistribute the extra revenue back to the landowners. Then it's going to be really hard to make it fair so that the landowners that are actively playing their game actually get what they deserve versus a landowner that just lets their land sit and all of a sudden they're collecting additional revenue that Illuvium brought in. But then in the free market model, the demand can go up as much as it wants. The overworld players will still only pay that $1, and it'll just be the units of fuel that go down for that in-game transaction. You know, if we're up, what are we at? Let's say 400% right here. Let me say this for the 10th time. The overworld players are still only going to pay that $1, but that $1 is going to buy them 75 units of fuel, which is going to get them that stage 1 travel. Now, I really hope I answered all of these questions and I made it as clear as possible. But again, leave comments down below. If we think this is a good model, I would be happy to spearhead an IIP for this. It's also been brought up by Diraji, I think, that there are other things that Illuvium needs to worry about right now versus this. That's fine. That just means that we have more time to figure this out and write an IIP if we need to. If you still think that the free market model doesn't work, then please let me know why, because I can keep making small adjustments or trying to clear things up so that everyone does understand it. And this is the kind of stuff that I think needs to be brought up, and I don't see that many other people talking about it. But that's it. See you in the next one.